Now, ar-Raazee, there's all different kinds of explanations of what exactly are these ahruf, what do they entail. I'll just give you one. There's others in Dr. Bilal's book. Ar-Raazee's explanation: variations between singular and plural and masculine and feminine. An example of that in Surah Al-Mu'minun, verse 8, وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِأَمَانَاتِهِمْ وَعَهْدِهِمْ رَاعُونَ. أَمَانَاتِهِمْ. Okay, there's a variant recitation, لِأَمَانَتِهِمْ. And again, the Uthmani Mus'haf accommodates that kind of thing because the alif is written above the line. It's a floating alif or dagger alif. And because it wasn't included in the actual written things. And of course, the vowels were none of them were written except some of the long vowels. So that was a way that the Uthmani Mus'haf accommodated these variations. The verbs could be in the variation between Madi, Mudari', and Amr. An example of that, فَقَالُوا رَبَّنَا بَاعِدْ بَيْنَ أَسْفَارِنَا. And a variant, فَقَالُوا رَبُّنَا بَعَّدَ بَيْنَ أَسْفَارِنَا. In Surah Saba, verse 19. And then another aspect is a variation in i'rab. In Surah Al-Buruj, verse 15, ذُو الْعَرْشِ الْمَجِيدِ. Okay, when you stop on it, it's not clear that there's a difference there, but there's one recitation that ذُو الْعَرْشِ الْمَجِيدِ, and another ذُو الْعَرْشِ الْمَجِيدُ. So depends on whether majid then is an adjective that modifies arsh, or whether it modifies zu, meaning referring to Allah. And then you have addition and deletion of letters and words. This famous variation in Surah Al-Layl, verse 3, وَمَا خَلَقَ الذَّكَرَ وَالْأُنْثَى, as opposed to وَالذَّكَرَ وَالْأُنْثَى. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that was one of those recitations that caused the dispute between the Syrians and the Iraqis when they were on in that military expedition that Hudayfa witnessed. Word order, وَجَاءَتْ سَكْرَةُ الْمَوْتِ بِالْحَقِّ, or وَجَاءَتْ سَكْرَةُ الْحَقِّ بِالْمَوْتِ. Substitution of letters. وَانْظُرْ إِلَى الْعِظَامِ كَيْفَ نُنْشِزُهَا. This is the Hafs recitation. There's a variant recitation, نُنْشِرُهَا. And then you have some differences in pronunciation, like I mentioned, like between imala and nahtimala, whatever they call the other one, and tafkhim and tarqiq and hamza, whether it's pronounced or not. Okay, so are the 7 ahruf still there in the Uthmani Mus'haf? As I said earlier, the effort was to accommodate as much of the authentic variation as conceivable. And that's why they wrote it the way they wrote it, and that's why these slight variations were acknowledged in the different mushafs that were sent to different centers. So you have, for instance, وَأَعَدَّ لَهُمْ جَنَّاتٍ تَجْرِي تَحْتَهَا الْأَنْهَارُ, Surah At-Tawbah, verse 100. And he prepared for them gardens beneath which rivers flow. Now, in most places in the Qur'an, you have tajri min tahtiha al-anhar in similar verses. But in that particular verse, all of the mushafs that were sent out were missing min there, except the mushaf that went to Makkah. So the Meccan mushaf acknowledges that variant in the recitation. And those are both mutawatir recitations. Now, there's a recitation of Ibn Abbas, which is not considered to be part of the Qur'an now. In other words, that this may have been a wording that was recited during the prophetic era, but it was eventually dropped, and it didn't make it into the Uthmani Mus'haf because there weren't two witnesses for it. In Surah Al-Kahf, when it's talking the story of Dhul Qarnayn, يَأْخُذُ كُلَّ سَفِينَةٍ غَصْبًا. That's وَكَانَ وَرَاءَهُمْ مَلِكٌ يَأْخُذُ كُلَّ سَفِينَةٍ غَصْبًا. That's the standard recitation. Ibn Abbas, he added the term صَالِحًا. يَأْخُذُ كُلَّ سَفِينَةٍ صَالِحَةٍ غَصْبًا. He's seizing every ship that's in working order, intact ship. He's seizing them. So that's not accommodated by the Uthmani Mus'haf. Then you have an example, فَيَقْتُلُونَ وَيُقْتَلُونَ. Now, there is a variant, I guess, where يُقْتَلُونَ وَيَقْتُلُونَ, whether it's the active or the passive voice comes first or second. That variation is accommodated. And then, some of the benefits of the variant recitations that they give expanded meaning, and we'll come to that in a minute when we're talking about the doubts about this issue. The major doubt is if these hadiths were true, and there's so many of them, so from an authenticity point of view, it's very hard to deny them. It says, but the doubt goes that if the hadiths on this topic were true, it would mean that the Qur'an is full of contradiction, which the Qur'an itself denies in Surah An-Nisa, verse 82. So the response to that is that the variation is actually another proof of its origin. Despite all the variation in the wording, there's no contradiction between them. There's no contradiction in meaning. And Al-Jazari is one of the famous scholars of the recitations. And he, by the way, he said, I spent 20 years trying to understand the hadiths about the Seven Ahruf, to understand what exactly is meant by the Seven Ahruf. So anyway, he said that all the variations between the recitations fall into three categories with regard to the meaning. The first is variations of pronunciation that reflect the variation of dialects with absolutely no difference at all in meaning. And that's examples of that pronunciation of the term as-sirat or alayhim, as we mentioned earlier, alayhim, alayhimu, alayhimu. Those have absolutely no difference in meaning. Second is variations of pronunciation that give a slight expansion of meaning, but both variations refer to the same object. And this is like the variations in Surah Al-Fatiha, Maliki Yawmiddin and Maliki Yawmiddin, the owner and the king of the Day of Judgment. So both of these are descriptions of Allah and they're aspects of His attribute. Another example of that, Nunshizuha, with talking about the bones and the verse about the man who passes by the city that had fallen to ruins. And then he says, how can Allah give life to this? And Allah causes him to die for 100 years. He brings him back to life. And then he's tells him to look at the bones of his donkey. Kayfa nunshizuha. Nunshizuha means to raise them up. Nunshiruha, give them life. And the meaning is essentially the same. Okay, you have some expansion, but it's talking about the same thing. And it's very, very close. And then the third is that the variation causes the wording to refer to two different things, but they're compatible and complementary. And the example that Zarqani gives is وَظَنُّوا أَنَّهُمْ قَدْ كُذِبُوا. In Surah Yusuf, verse 110, that's the Hafs recitation. And there's the other recitation, كُذِّبُوا. with a shadda. So kudhibu means that they had been denied, that their veracity had been called into question, and that second recitation would mean that the prophets became certain that they were considered liars, and the other kudhibu, they thought they'd been lied to, refers to the ones to whom the prophets were sent. They thought the prophets had lied to them. So the pronoun, the wow, is referring back to two different groups of people, but they're the two parties in the same event, and again, it's revolving around the same issue. Fundamentally, it's giving you two sides of it. Now, Ibn Masud, Zarqani quotes him, he said, "Do not disagree regarding the Qur'an, and do not dispute about it, for verily it does not contradict itself. Don't you see that the Sharia of Islam is a single unity in its limits and the meanings of its recitations, and that the order of Allah in it is a single unity? If one recitation, harf, commanded something while another prohibited it, that would be contradiction. But in fact, it combines all of them in a comprehensive unity, that is, of meaning. So whoever is reciting by a recitation that was taught by the Prophet ﷺ, he should not abandon it out of distaste for it. For whoever rejects one harf of it has rejected all of it." Now, it's mentioned that when Uthmaan ordered that everybody turn in their mushaf, their personal copies of Quran, to be burnt, that Ibn Masud, he was upset by that, because he had his personal mushaf, and he said, I was learning Quran while Zayd ibn Thabit was still suckling at his mother's breast, and so there was some kind of hurt feelings, that maybe because he hadn't been included in the committee that made those copies. The fact is that Ibn Masud was in Iraq, and when Hudayfa came, and this was an urgent matter, they dealt with it on an urgent basis. So they gathered qualified people that were there in the Hijaz to deal with it. And eventually, Ibn Masud, he relented, and he went along with that which had been agreed upon by the community as a whole. Now, another aspect about the issue of the ahruf is that, Allah is making it easy for you now. All of you different Arabs, you who are reciting the Tamimi dialect, or, speaking the Tamimi dialect and the Hudali dialect and the Qurashi dialect, whatever dialect you want to use, come and bring something like the Qur'an. And they were unable to do it. So that's another aspect of the ahruf actually contributing to the miraculous, to our realization of the miraculous nature of the Quran.